Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. I am your host, Johnnie Arnold, and this is the Flashback Podcast. So what exactly is the Flashback Podcast? So this is a new podcast, and it's really just the perspective of myself as a Gen Xer. I was born in the late 70s, grew up in the 80s and 90s, and now, I'm in my mid 40s. It's really just all about all of the wonderful memories that I have growing up and all of the influential movies, TV shows, cartoons, music, video games, all those types of things that spawned decades of some of the most beloved and iconic characters in history. It's really just me kind of experiencing that whole part of my life growing up and being there for when these things actually came out and they were brand new and fresh and existed. It's also about the differences between the world we live in today and the world that, like myself and others, knew growing up in the 80s and 90s. So here's a question for you. Do you know why corporations are targeting Generation X so hard right now? And honestly, it's just a really simple answer. It's because nostalgia sells. That's right. Nostalgia is one of the easiest things to sell, especially to Gen Xers. And speaking for myself, really, it just reminds me of better days. It reminds me of the best parts of my childhood. Kind of makes me feel young again. It reminds me of everything that was so special back then that it literally became part of what molded me into who I became as an adult. It has influenced some of the things that I try to instill into my children as they grow up. I want my kids to be able to experience some of the most wonderful things I experienced as a kid. And I love sharing those experiences with them. Like, my kids love Back to the Future movies and Star Wars and just the whole shebang of Goonies, just all the things that we grew up with. And I have absolutely loved introducing them to some of the things that I loved as a kid. And that goes right along with the movies, the music, the comic books, the video games. And hopefully it helps them along the way, to become their own person. You see, I can still look back and remember, the feeling of being that 6-year-old little boy excited to see the very first Ghostbusters when it was newly released to theaters. I can still remember that feeling of being so mesmerized by the story and the theatrical experience that it literally embedded itself into my very soul and being. And Ghostbusters is just one of many movies that I will never forget experiencing in the theaters. A few others were 2 of the 3 original Star Wars movies. I was born a little too late for A New Hope, which was released in 1977, and I was born in 78. Of course, there was the Back to the Future trilogy. There was the Goonies, Indiana Jones, E.T., and, so many others that are now considered like cinematic legends. Of course, we also had some of the best and most memorable cartoons back then as well. We had He-Man, Transformers, Thundercats, Mask, G.I. Joe, the Smurfs, Looney Tunes, Captain Harlock, Voltron, and that's just to name a few. Our cartoons were cutting edge. They were driven by storylines that were unique and innovative, and the artwork itself was crafted so amazingly well. Guys, this podcast isn't going to be all about the 80s and 90s movies and cartoons. It will also be about the differences between those times and now. I'll be covering how much the world has changed from my own perspective and experiences. And of course, I'm going to be sharing some of the memories that I have growing up in the 80s and 90s from a small child to a young adult. With this podcast, I really hope to bring a little insight into the younger generations into what it's like for some of us middle-aged folks growing up and how much everything really has changed. The year was 1980 when two of the most iconic horror films in American history were released. First being Friday the 13th, and the second being Stephen King's The Shining. Now, even though I was only 2 years old when these two movies were released, Friday the 13th is still one of those movies that once I did see it, it stuck with me forever. I mean, how can you not? How could it not just stick with you forever? And even today, you know, you're hard pressed to find someone that has never heard of Friday the 13th or the murderous villain Jason Voorhees, or even that infamous camp name of Crystal Lake, especially during, you know, coming up on Halloween. Even though in the first Friday the 13th, you know, Jason wasn't the killer, it's still branded more than a decade of Jason Voorhees. That razor sharp machete, and of course the wonderful little hockey mask that he used to cover up his pruned up face. Personally, I have never really been a huge Friday the 13th fan. I wasn't a huge fan of the franchise at all. But there is no denying the uniqueness that it brought into the horror genre. Now, The Shining, on the other hand, terrified the hell out of me when I was a kid. Still to this day, I am a die-hard fan of that movie. Even though I wasn't old enough to see it during its original theatrical release, I still remember seeing it on television. And that's where I saw it for the first time. And then I later saw it as I got older, uncensored and in its entirety on VHS. You know, I can still remember that whole creep factor of the twin girls standing in the hallway chanting, "Come play with us, Danny." And the old woman in the shower, the blood pouring from the walls, Jack and Wendy, you know, constantly tripping out on each other. And of course, Danny, the creepy kid on the big wheels that had The Shining. That movie was so well done artistically and environmentally and cinematically. Just the environment itself, using the infamous Stanley Hotel as an example, gave us that claustrophobic feeling when they're trapped in the snowstorm in the jacked up narrow hallways with that wild patterned carpet. You know, that kind of stuff burned itself into my head forever. The cinematic storytellers of the 80s knew how to do it. They had to be creative and innovative when it came to the silver screen, especially to the silver screen. When they were creating horror and science fiction movies and TV shows, they had to rely on really their artistic and skilled ways of doing things. It seems like, you know, today we just don't get that. We don't get that anymore. Many of today's, you know, movies and television shows feel forced and artificial, with really no unique storytelling behind it. And it just really relies on all the CGI. It's really sad that they have to rely so heavily on computer graphics and the whole green screen environments now, as in comparison to, you know, the 80s and 90s when, you know, they really just couldn't. That wasn't available, so they had to figure out ways to make things work. And, you know, these are just a couple of examples of what made the 80s and 90s different, and in many cases better. I think that as the podcast progresses, I will dig deeper into more of my own childhood memories and my own life's, you know, progression and how I saw things, remember things of my past. So hopefully, you know, it will give you guys kind of even if you're not a Gen Xer or if you weren't raised in the 80s or 90s, it'll give you guys kind of a different viewpoint on, you know, on things like what we got to experience. You know, we predated the internet. We predated affordable home PCs. You know, we predated the crazy graphics cards and the CGI and we really had it so that we were able to experience real artistic magic and cinematic magic and cartoon magic and music magic. You know, these are the kind of things that we got to experience. And if you guys stick with the podcast you know, even if you're reminiscing back with me, or if you are part of the younger generation that never got to experience any of these things and you are interested in stuff like this, then this is the perfect place for you. So really, until next time, until next episode, make sure to come over and visit me over at Twitch and YouTube, and under the name of Johnnie Shades. And that's where you're going to find me live streaming some video games such as World of Warcraft, Doom, Eternal, Team Sonic Racing, and so many others. Just a lot of the games that I love to play. And I'm sure that Tina and Megan and John are all going to be joining me on some of these live streams. Until next time, this is Johnnie Arnold. Peace out.